thanks all again for joining us this morning. It's great to be with you all today. We are going to be talking about something that has really been highlighted, I believe, over the last year, going into the pandemic and entering what we call this new normal. So we're going to be talking about ensuring equitable broadband access during challenging times. So I know all of you are familiar with the fact that, work has been going online. Kids are now at school, probably driving their parents crazy learning online. And, just the entire retail industry has been turned on the head now that folks are trying to, make sure people are ordering online safely to keep capacity at stores down. So it really changed a lot of things about the way we've been living. And with that comes, some real challenges to especially those folks that either don't have access or they don't have reliable access to the internet. I mean, low-income communities, rural folks, the list goes on and on. So I'm really excited to be talking with our panelists today about these things and more, equity about broadband, but also equity in general related to smart regions efforts and technology and whatnot. So I'm gonna give a chance for everybody to sort of give you an update on what they've been working on as it relates to these issues, and then we're going to have a conversation. So feel free to give us some questions in the Q&A box or in the chat, whatever you're more comfortable with at any time, and we'll be sure to incorporate those in our discussions and at a Q&A specific portion at the end. So with that, I think I'm just going to go in order here. So I'll start off with John Walton, who's the Chief Information Officer from the County of San Mateo, California.
Thanks. Really appreciate being here today with this panel. Excited to talk about this topic and what we're doing in San Mateo County. I've been the CIO here for 5 or 6 years now, and our journey started when I first started. There was an interest by the Board of Supervisors and County Manager to really be thoughtful about digital equity. San Mateo County is probably seen as one of the wealthiest counties in California, sort of on a per capita basis. However, it overlooks, we're a very diverse county, very large, 500 square miles, and there's huge areas of the county out by the coast and more of the rural farmland areas, and even in some of our older communities internally near the Bayside that really don't have good connectivity. And so we started this to really think about, as we put services online in government, how do we ensure that the services we're putting online are accessible by everyone, not just the people with good internet access or broadband? Because as governments shift more and more of their services to the internet, I think sometimes inadvertently we overlook the fact that not all of our citizens or customers in our areas have equal access to the internet and the same amount of data or broadband access. So we started working on that kind of slowly over the last 5 years. We stood up about 100 public Wi-Fi sites, more in community centers and county and city centers. And then COVID hit and it kind of exploded overnight on us, with everybody going home to telework and kids in 23 school districts, 100,000 kids all trying to distance learn. And suddenly what was sort of a nascent understanding of what the digital divide was and the equity issues really came to the forefront of everyone's mind, because suddenly, that burden of society not being able to be connected and be educated or work from home became a huge issue. So we're very fortunate to have access to the federal CARES funds. And so we've invested, or we've committed about $7 million worth of CARES funds to working with the school districts and cities and communities, business districts, to connect those areas better wirelessly through Wi-Fi connectivity. For our large area, really wireless is the only way we could quickly and equitably distribute public internet access. So that's where we're at today, and I don't want to take up too much time because we have a big panel, but always happy to talk more about that or answer questions.
Great, thanks, John. So we will go over to Skip Newberry, President of Technology Association of Oregon, who got a shout out in the last session. So we'll be excited to hear from you.
Great. I'll try not to disappoint. Yeah, I was grateful that Wilf Pinfold, who does a lot of work with us here in the area, was willing to take one for the team and do the earlier session, since it's now 8:30. He started bright and early on the West Coast. But yeah, Skip Newberry, President and CEO of the Technology Association of Oregon, and here in the Portland area, as well as elsewhere around the state, we're seeing a really important focus since March with the onset of COVID that has really, I think, underscored some of the digital divide issues that we're seeing among different communities, both businesses as well as individuals, and then of course school districts around the state. And what we saw was that the sort of focus around remote learning, remote work really exacerbated a lot of these divisions. And John, I think, articulated a really important point, which is, with more government services being delivered through the internet and online, there is a big equity and access issue here with a lot of the connectivity focus. And we've been doing some stuff here in the state at both the state level and locally as it relates to policy, both looking at different ways that through fees on telecommunications providers, money can be provided to help fund greater efforts to build out infrastructure to those communities and businesses and households that don't have it. I'll talk about that a little bit later. I know we've got some good questions along those lines. And then we've also been seeing a lot of businesses and individuals come together to focus on the device issue, because it's not just connectivity, but also access to hardware, access to software, and then of course the technical assistance, the services needed to help folks that maybe don't have a lot of familiarity with accessing the internet or different applications. And so it's a really complex issue, and look forward to talking more about it today. But we're definitely seeing a renewed focus on this from a much broader portion of the population here since March, which is, I think, a good thing and cause for some optimism in terms of our ability to collectively address this issue.
Thanks, Skip. All right, next we'll go to Aaron Deakin, who is the Managing Director of KC Digital Drive, moving across the country here.
Thanks, Maisie, and thanks for having us. This is a great panel and great topic. For those of you who don't know, which is probably most of you, our organization is about 8 years old. We are a regional civic technology nonprofit in Kansas City, and we actually sprung up largely around work to address the digital divide when Google Fiber started their rollout in Kansas City. And at that point, it was really looking at infrastructure. When you think about fiber infrastructure deployments, there is a really fundamental infrastructure layer of how we think about access. So we did a lot of work in those early days in making sure that we were able to get this fiber infrastructure installed in some of our poorest and least invested communities across the region. And that really kicked off a whole regional sort of emphasis on digital equity issues that hadn't really risen to the level of prominence before that. And the kind of full stack of digital inclusion efforts, thinking about how you go from the infrastructure, which was really the focus in those early days and is an important focus, but is frustrating to a lot of people because it doesn't really get to the downstream impacts that people want to have, whether it's, the education outcomes or the healthcare outcomes or the civic participation outcomes or economic outcomes. So we've had a coalition for digital inclusion that has sprung up over those past 8 years. We serve on the steering committee of that. We're up to about 50 or 60 members and kind of developed a loose alliance framework. It's more of a convening and facilitation body than it is an action body, and that has been by design for a number of reasons. But it's really helped to bring some intentionality and visibility to the digital inclusion work. And it has also, as the others have mentioned, as COVID has brought some of these digital issues into really stark relief, as people have been forced to remote work and forced to do distance learning, the opportunity to create some more coalition-like action activities in the region. So one of the programs that we are standing up now, backed both by some CARES Act dollars as well as a philanthropic regional recovery fund, is an internet access support program. And this is really around the, and so we've got an infrastructure piece to this, but it's basically a utility support fund. You know, we've got ways for people to help pay their electric bills and their gas bills. We haven't had a way to help them pay their internet bills in an emergency situation. And so we're building that process out right now. It's quite a bit more complex because the internet marketplace is a competitive landscape, and you're also dealing with national providers who are doing this same function in lots of cities, whereas our electric and gas utility kind of just have to deal with one local provider, and all of the households are using the same provider. You don't need to make choices about what's the best package. So we're kind of building out both a navigator system to help identify the best providers and solutions for individual households and families, and then figuring out sort of the mechanisms by which to pay those bills. It's a 6-month support program that can cover arrears payments or connection fees and device fees, and 6 months of service, available to families at 200% of the poverty level or below who have been affected by COVID and need it for one of these sort of specific use cases. So this has been a super exciting opportunity. Happy to dig into more of the nuts and bolts, and it'll be really messy because the funds were delivered about a month ago and signed off on, in this rush to spend CARES Act money before the end of the year. So it's been a really kind of fun learning process, but a lot of work and still very much in the building process.
Great, thank you. I'm looking for the federal funding in the CARES Act. It's exciting to hear that several of you are utilizing that funding, and I know it's been a quick learning process. You're basically building the plane as you're flying it, but really excited to see that funding going to good use. And finally, we will go to Mimi Ye, who is the Vice President of Human Capital in my home region, the Connected DMV.
Hi everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Thanks. It's really nice to see everybody and listen to all of the background and information from my other panelists. I feel like I found my tribe. I'm so excited. It's hard to talk about some of these concepts with other leaders and other organizations, and it's fantastic to find a forum where there's acknowledgement and understanding of not just the opportunity, but also the complexity that comes with the things that we aspire to achieve. So let me tell you a little bit about Connected DMV. We started as a much smaller strategic initiative within the Greater Washington Board of Trade, and we have since spun off into our own 501c3 nonprofit established in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We are focused, while we're established in Virginia, we're focused on all of Greater Washington. So what we call it the DMV because it encapsulates the District of Columbia, suburban Maryland, and parts of Northern Virginia, probably about 27 different jurisdictions across the 2 states in the district. So it's very large, very diverse, very complex. We've got about 6.3 million residents and 1 million new residents projected to join this property area within the next 25 years. From an economy standpoint, I'll say prior to COVID, this was an area that had about a $540 billion economy. If we were to compare it as a country, if we were to treat the region as a country, it would be the 22nd largest country. Again, before COVID, because that just really threw everything off of its axis. 27 different governments at the local, state, and federal level, about 17 different colleges and universities. So there's quite a lot of diversity of perspective, of population, of communities, and of organizations that we're really seeking to create some coalition and some partnerships around. When COVID happened in the Metro DC area, it really challenged our region's resilience, certainly from an infrastructure standpoint, definitely from an economy standpoint, from a health standpoint, from all of those basic services and needs that everybody has come to rely on. So in Connected DMV, we established a task force. We called it the COVID-19 Strategic Renewal Task Force. It's comprised of 51 cross-sector leaders, including representatives from local governments, nonprofits, colleges and universities, and even some federal government agencies, but with local representatives. And we looked to them to help us figure out how we could strengthen our infrastructure and our durability in the region. Our aspiration was not to go back to where we were in March before COVID hit, but really, taking that phrase of never letting a good crisis go to waste. How might we take a second look at infrastructure, the policy, the way that our public-private academia and communities work together so that we may come out of this better and stronger even than we were before COVID happened. So one of the initiatives that we've looked at, the task force has approved about 12 different initiatives. One is called Connectivity for All, and it certainly focuses very much on broadband access to, as everybody has mentioned, the equipment, the connection. We also look at digital literacy, and I know a couple of folks have also mentioned that as an essential component of all of this. In the Metro DC area, we have 300,000 residents without broadband access today, and about 40,000 individuals who live in areas where broadband is just not available. It's just not provided by any of the service providers. So we look at those areas and we think about the type of solutions that would really enable access and participation into the economy and into the community, as well as how might we do this from a way that takes social equity and economic renewal at the forefront of everything that we're trying to do, including Connectivity for All, but also including some of the other programs that we can talk about at a later point. So that's a little bit of what we're doing, and excited to get into more of a conversation with everyone. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Wow, I feel like we could talk all day about everything that you all are doing, everything that you're accomplishing, and how you I really like the phrase that you use, the never letting a crisis go to waste, because I feel like that's the whole thing about resiliency, right? It's making sure that when things like this do happen, that you try to get ahead of it, you build back better, and you are ready for the next one. So yeah, wow, there's so many questions that I would like to ask, but I think something that kept popping up is partnerships, and I feel like that's really critical. So something I know that our members personally grapple with is how to shore up community buy-in for regional projects, especially if it's something that is more technical, like technology, installing fiber, or internet access, and what that means. And so how are you motivating individuals, regional leaders, businesses, you name it, to support your equity and tech efforts? And I don't know who to throw it to first, so whoever wants to grab that.
I'm happy to
go
jump
ahead,
in.
please.
Oh, go ahead.
All right, unmuted. Let me take a first cut at it, and I'll try to be really quick and open it up to everyone else. I think we look at this in two ways. One was that task force that I mentioned. We carefully and deliberately selected members that represent, as best as we could, all of the different backgrounds and perspectives across the region. So some of our task force members include the president and CEO of the region's largest organization that works to solve hunger. So it's a large food bank in the area. We have the publisher of the Washington Informer, which is more of a grassroots publication that provides a significant voice on racial and social issues in the region. We have the director of DC Health's Office of Health Equity, and that person advises the task force on equity with an informed approach for recovery and renewal. We also have the executive vice president and COO of AARP to make sure that we're also considering the needs of the aging and elderly. So that's one way that we really try to stay cognizant and aware that the solutions that we're coming up with, we certainly want them to revive the economy. We certainly want them to create more resilience and durability in the infrastructure. And we recognize that within Greater Washington, as one example, we have some of the wealthiest zip codes and we have some of the poorest zip codes. And the solutions that we come up with, and more importantly, the execution and deployment of those solutions, we really need to strive to find a way to deliver them in an equitable way. One other quick example I'll mention is we have an initiative that looks to coordinate the contact tracing activities across DC, Maryland, and Virginia, because right now everybody uses their own contact tracing system, their own collection process, their own way of creating contact lists and notifying people when folks have been exposed. We certainly recognize the value of interoperability of those systems and sharing that information, particularly as residents cross the borders on a daily basis, and so does the virus. One element that we do think is important is health literacy, because a lot of people are either unaware, uninformed, or distrusting of some of the programs that are out there. So within Connected DMV, we partnered with an organization called Grapevine Health. And Grapevine Health is led up by a doctor, Dr. Lisa Fitzpatrick. She used to be a CDC physician. She is a disease expert, and she has created a program called Feet on the Street. And that's really about going out to different neighborhoods that are less represented and get less health services than others, and providing more grassroots information and education through vignettes, through storytelling, through means that enable all of the populations to better understand and hopefully trust the healthcare services that are being offered, so that as a whole and as a region, we're all able to benefit from that. And then population health is also able to improve. So let me stop there.
That was excellent. Difficult to follow that. No, really, I just want to emphasize the point of sort of making sure that any sort of steering committee or work group is as inclusive and representative of the broader community as possible. And one thing I noticed when I worked in government for the city of Portland was we often had challenges communicating to and connecting with certain communities that were distrustful for good reason over a long history of many generations of the government not serving them well. And so we had to look to build trust with key folks from those communities who could be translators and say, no, look, I've verified that the government is going to do what it says it's going to do. Truly, this is something that is going to benefit the population. Trust me, because you do, that the government is going to, be good on its word here. And so looking at sort of these distributed, decentralized networks of, this term's overused and can be kind of negative, but influencers, essentially people who are trusted within their communities. I think this notion of trust is really important in a lot of this work when it comes to technology, because there is, especially with emerging technologies, a lot of disinformation, misinformation out there, and skepticism, frankly, because in some cases, technology has been used to kind of extract data and value out of communities. And so people are, becoming a little bit more distrustful of some of these business models. So government, in using technology, really has to think critically around, okay, how do we overcome these barriers? And so like with the Digital Inclusion Network in Portland, which is a multi-agency, multi-government, multi-sector initiative that was created a number of years ago, one thing that's been good about that effort is that it includes a bunch of different organizations that are trying to solve various aspects of the digital divide, whether it's some of the hardware issues, software, networks, but also access. And some of that is geographic. And so there's a tendency with government to say, all right, well, you have to come to City Hall to, share your thoughts in person, when you're commenting on some legislation. Well, that's really tough. So how do you kind of create this distributed network that is not only digital, but also physical to reach people with some of these resources? So a key part here is the library system. And in Portland, Oregon, and Multnomah County, so the libraries are part of Multnomah County. And they are second only to New York City in terms of throughput, in terms of the volume of people using the branches. And yet the total floor space or office space occupied by those libraries could collectively all fit, if you put all the branches together, in the main branch of the Seattle Library. So it's hyper distributed, kind of like micro office around the region. And those serve as community centers and places where people can access the internet. And they're within walking distance in a lot of cases of a vast majority of the residents and businesses. So looking at this sort of decentralized, distributed nature And the library systems are far more trusted than every other aspect of government here. Through extensive polling, we found that over the years. So, so those are some creative approaches, I think, where both through physical, tangible infrastructure, as well as some of the digital, better inclusion efforts can result in better outcomes, thinking through how to build trust with communities.
Yeah, no, this is great. It's a great question and topic. You know, we're a small staffed organization. We have about 4 or 5 people on staff, and are very much a network, you know, partnership based organization that manifests itself differently in the different pieces of work that we do. And it's interesting to see which communities lend to which models. And I don't know that it's based sort of on a specific community as much as it's based on what like the landscape of the local ecosystem is. So with digital equity issues, you know, our coalition has really been a practitioner community, and has built from, you know, again, going back 7 or 8 years, there were people that were actually, you know, doing the work, who had it as sort of a core mission function. And that was, you know, the libraries have been a huge leader in that. We had new organizations that set up with digital equity issues as a key mission. Sometimes you'd have government, a lot of times it was individuals. So you've got kind of a question like, is your partnership because the organization that you're dealing with makes a commitment to an issue, or there just happens to be a person within the organization who's adopted this as an issue or carries the banner. And so like, you've kind of got to think about, you know, at what sort of level your partnership is formed, and then what kind of mechanisms do you set up? So like, we had a long discussion when we you know, built a membership platform, and that probably oversells what it actually is. You know, it's a one-pager that says I commit to these few things, but are we asking the organization to sign it or an individual to sign it? And you want to have a way for individuals to participate, but we made a decision to really make membership in the coalition at an organizational level to kind of sort of reinforce organizational commitment to what was sometimes really an individual passion. So, you know, in a space like digital inclusion where there wasn't, you know, a robust ecosystem 15 years ago, certainly not to the extent that it is now, you really got to kind of like look at what the mechanisms are that reflect the work that's happening in your community. But I think that's kind of the thread that runs through all of our, you know, partnership building exercises, and is a really sort of core value of our organization is, let's build those relationships from the people who are doing the work and who are in the community. And so we really look, whether it's, you know, in our entrepreneurship work and dealing with kind of business creation and emerging technologies, or in our, you know, healthcare work, or in any of the other verticals that we kind of work in, it's who's doing things that is meaningful. And we tend to engage there first, rather than let's go to the CEO or the executive director or the university chancellor and get, you know, their signature. So we kind of work up. University is another good example. Like, we work with a ton of professors who are doing research in, you know, whatever the area is that we're working on. So there's, you know, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 different professors at a few of the local universities who are doing a lot of work in digital equity, digital transformation, you know, trusted communities and digital spaces. We know them, and you know, look for opportunities to engage them, and vice versa. But we may not know the person as well in the research office or in the provost's office. And so, and I'd say we've gotten to over time, and those are important relationships to have. But I guess it's sort of a bottom-up trusted relationship and partnership building strategy, rather than top-down, which I think is more traditional in a lot of civic coalition building kind of efforts. Like, let's get all the CEOs from the big companies, or all of the, you know, mayors together, or all of the, you know, leaders of these civic organizations, and come up with strategies that way. We've got kind of definitely think that's important, and need to take advantage of those networks, but come at it a little bit differently.
All right. I'll jump to another question here, and maybe I'll start with John to get him into the conversation. Between all the competing priorities of local and regional leaders that they're being faced with every day, especially with the coronavirus and everything that's going on with that, it's not a surprise that addressing equity isn't for these kinds of projects isn't at the top of the list when you have, funding to be concerned of building new programs from the ground up. So how are you making equity and diversity more of a priority among your staff and leadership for these kinds of projects? And what are you doing to make sure it's an integral part of all your planning and implementation conversations?
Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting. We've talked about this in some other forums. And I do think there's kind of maybe, I know we tend to focus a lot on the negative side of the pandemic, understandably, because of the impact on people's lives and the economy. But I think, if there was any benefit at all, it's brought us together closer as a community to think about how to address these challenges, not be so, I think, stuck in our silos of our kind of old ways of thinking or our old organizational structures. And equity and diversity and inclusion is a big part of that conversation. And I think in government, even in business and communities, I think we sort of fall into patterns of behavior unintentionally over time sometimes. We don't really realize those until something comes along, unfortunately in this case, like a pandemic, to disrupt those ways of thinking or those patterns of thinking and behavior. So for us, really, once we get over the initial emergency of sending people home and sheltering in place and setting up testing centers and things like that, I think we really did, as an entire county, as a region even, step back and really start thinking about, well, what does this mean, right? How do you make healthcare equitable? How do you make value diversity? Because, you talk about trust and you talk about building community. When government just goes in and tries to implement a solution without buy-in from the communities, Skip was talking about libraries are trusted, right? But it's also, on the coast side, there's a lot of English as a second language, Spanish. If you're not Spanish speaking, and I try to send some of my non-Spanish speaking employees out there to implement Wi-Fi, there's obviously an immediate disconnect because they can't discuss with the community what their challenges are. And so why are we out there hanging things from poles, and what does that mean? And so trust issues become a big deal. So I think it really forced us to step back and realize that connecting with the community, having a diverse workforce, thinking about digital inclusion and digital equity. Sure, we have a project list, even in my department, of 50 or 60 projects we were working on. But then we had to step back and say, okay, if the community doesn't value these like we value these, and we're not connecting with the community we serve and how these projects serve them or how these projects serve the departments we support that serve the community, then it's not really sort of the IT people to decide what our favorite projects are, but really look through it through the equity and diversity lens of how do these serve the community we're serving. And it has caused us to rethink and kind of retool, to bring in different partners. I mean, the blessing of CARES funding is, it's a lot of cash, but it has to be spent quickly. For government, we don't move quickly, unfortunately. I can't staff up or do things as quickly as I'd like in government sometimes, but we don't want to waste the opportunity. To your point, it is really a very short runway in government speak when it comes to procurement. But again, that's given us the opportunity to bring in a different set of partners where we sort of had a standard pattern of the partners we always worked with behind the scenes. And we were able to really think through, okay, how do we bring in communication partners and community engagement partners, not just technical partners, so that we're making technical progress, but we're also taking this opportunity to build a more diverse workforce, not just diverse in language and in ethnicity or in gender, but the public-private partnership diversity. How do we get more collaboration there? How do we better leverage the community resources we have? In San Mateo County, we have a lot of tech people who live here and want to give back to the community. So this has given us the opportunity to bring the community in to not just provide feedback, but actually hands-on volunteer efforts to make their communities better. So I think that's part of what CIOs and what leaders in government really need to think about is we tend to gravitate towards what's the best technical solution. And we try to do sort of this big bang behind the scenes effect of let's go work quietly in the shadows or in our dark offices and then launch something on the public in sort of some unexpected way and think that's going to be successful. And I think we've learned the hard way over the years that that doesn't work well, and community inclusion and having that perspective going into it and a communication plan, engagement plan is really kind of the key to no matter what, fiber, Wi-Fi, cellular, any type of online service. If you don't really engage with the community where they're at in their style, in their communities, you go out and meet with them, that you're just not going to be successful.
That's great. Thank you. Did anybody else have that sort of step back moment where it kind of made them look at their whole portfolio and realize that, a more long-term equity lens is necessary to be able to serve all the needs of everyone in the community?
So
Lots of nods, yes.
well, it's interesting, and I love kind of how these different questions get phrased that go to the same topic. Because I would say, in some sense, we didn't have. I mean, that was kind of how that was our start, right? So it wasn't so much a step back and we need to do this. I would say a couple things though. I mean, one, like we don't do a good enough job from a, just an organizational standpoint in terms of our, board and structure. I mean, we always want to be more inclusive and bring more people into the work that we do. I mean, part of the partnership model and kind of working with people who do the work is part of our answer to that, because we know that we're small and we can only do so much from a structural standpoint. So we want to make sure to work with people who are doing the work, which is one way to kind of get that engagement level going. But I think the other, I guess, kind of comment that I'd make that I feel like is not often acknowledged enough is that there is a tension between being inclusive and deliberative and, really taking the time and especially the extra time to reach those that are hardest to reach and being able to get things done quickly or well. So you're always making that trade-off. And I think, you've got some people who are more inclined to be like, well, yeah, we just got to get it done. We don't have time to go talk to those people or to go out to those neighborhoods or to engage because there are people that have that role and that need to do that. So it's important to understand that. And then there are people on the other side of the spectrum that, are like, well, yeah, but we've got to have more meetings. We got to go out and just spend time. We've got to live with them. You've got to go move in with this family for 6 months before you can even think that you can make a decision on a bit of an exaggeration. But I mean, there are open source communities that are great communities and I love and find very energizing. But I mean, I can be in meetings for 6 months and I'm like, how you're not even getting anything done. You're having the same conversation that you were having 3 years ago. So, I think it's an interesting, we're trying to address that sort of systematically as we continue to build out structure into different initiatives. But I don't know that there's a necessarily an easy answer. And I think it's a tension that we kind of all have to live with, that it's important. I find our best partners and stakeholders are the ones who really get that and feel both sides of that and can help us, navigate it in any particular project.
Yeah, can I maybe just add something real quickly? Sorry, Skip, I didn't mean to talk over you.
No worries, go for it.
I logged in just as the last panel was wrapping up, and so I didn't catch their whole panel. I don't mean to take anything out of context. I just thought there was some interesting questions at the end of the last panel when we talk about equity and inclusion and diversity. The word that caught my attention that is still talked about a lot when it comes to digital inclusion or digital divide is, for me, it's a trigger word of subsidize. Government is subsidizing, or we need to provide a subsidy to communities. And I think that alone indicates kind of a mindset in our society and how we view who is deserving of access, as if people are making a conscious choice not to spend money on having adequate or reasonable types of bandwidth to do distance learning. I mean, to me, subsidizing is really just about lowering the cost of something in a competitive fashion to make it less costly. It's not really addressing the issue that perhaps people just can't afford, no matter what the price point is, right? So To me, it's kind of a sort of unconscious bias we have towards some of our communities and areas that they need to be subsidized because they can't figure it out for themselves, as if they had some option they are simply not exercising. And I think that alone, for us, at least in our community, has really sort of been a call to action, that we don't view this as a subsidy or that we're doing anyone a favor. We really view this as a basic need that everyone deserves and requires a certain level of access to have a level playing field so we can thrive as a community, that it's not one part of the community doing a favor to another. It's really all of us supporting each other to be a strong community as a whole.
I was just going to add a couple of points, which is, a lot of the data since COVID hit in March shows that Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been impacted more negatively by COVID in terms of impacts to communities, individuals' health, et cetera. And I think there's an element of, at least in what we're seeing in the Portland area, where the government is trying to intervene in a targeted way to make sure that there are more resources available to folks who need them most. And digital equity and broadband and wireless services is one area. And they've been trying to leverage CARES Act funding. There's some state funding that's been provided as well. And I mentioned earlier during the intro, there's some legislation that's been proposed by Representative Pam Marsh to look at a sort of a cellular fee that would then have a portion of it go to fund additional connectivity and broadband, more rural focused. And there's also an organization called Link Oregon that was created legislatively and funded that is looking at how to leverage the university research network for high-speed broadband, and are there ways to extend that out to schools and other sort of under-resourced areas within the state. And then there's also now an Oregon broadband office that is looking at some of these issues and has some funding. But the challenge in all of this work is the expense involved in not only building the infrastructure, but also maintaining it. And then someone else, I think in the chat, mentioned like the importance of devices. So then you've got that layer on top of it. And then of course, there's the training and technical assistance to get people online. So I think in a lot of this, also John Fink, I think, mentioned in the chat, like equity is also a broad construct potentially. And so I think people are trying to wrestle with a number of definitions and also ways that they can, given limited resources, kind of prioritize tackling equity, because you've got non-able-bodied individuals as well that have been dramatically impacted by lack of access in a lot of ways, not just digital. Since the onset of COVID. And I think a lot of communities are trying to focus on, okay, where do we start first? And I think it can be overwhelming given the amount of limited resources that folks are playing with.
See if I could just add 2 points, and I promise I'll try to keep it short, because I respect and really value everything that everybody else has said. And I particularly liked and agree strongly, violently, with what John was saying, that, connectivity and broadband, it's not an entitlement. It is a basic essential service. Totally agree with that, and we see it the same way like a utility, like electricity or gas or water, right? This is something that everybody needs access to broadband so that everybody can participate in today's economy and in today's world, and can, really contribute to it, and then really build and grow their respective regions. One quick point on this whole conversation of equity. I think we've all seen, and it's certainly been brought up a lot in recent events, there's that graphic that shows the difference between equity and equality. And it's that picture of a couple of kids trying to peer over a fence into a baseball game or whatever, some sporting game that's happening that they don't have tickets to, right? And the thought of equality is that everyone has a box that is the same height that they're all standing on to try to look over the fence, but everyone's at a different height. So not everybody's going to get it, right? And then equity is this idea that the size of the box is proportionate to your height, so that eventually we can all look over that fence. So there's ongoing debate, and I don't know what the right answer is. And I know that, to try to achieve equity gets into much bigger and broader systemic changes that would need to be made to the core infrastructure of how our different regions and basically how our whole nation is built. For us, one area that we look at, it's not the only one, but I think we look at equality of opportunity, right? So that how might we remove some of the barriers and some of the obstacles? It doesn't mean that everybody's going to get the same outcome, but if you could remove some of those barriers, then at least everyone has the same opportunity. And what they choose to do with that opportunity ultimately rests with them. But if there are things that we can do as regional organizations, as digital infrastructure, social, health, and equity focused organizations to remove those barriers, then I feel like that's a big part of what we can contribute to our respective areas.
And I want to add on that. I'm glad you brought that up, because I mean, there's I think baked into what you're saying, sort of the question of interoperability of our systems, and not the internet, hard infrastructure systems, but our social support systems, right? And when you think about that, that graphic of the stool in the baseball game, like it's sometimes, you've got these two competing views of things, and one is like the systems view. And so you've got, for a long time, people weren't taking the systems view. So you've had this kind of shift, I think, which has been healthy in a lot of ways. Like, we want to design the system and help all of these parts work together so that we see the outcome that we want. But the flip side of that is you get more of the systems view, which again, I share, we do a lot of, but like sometimes people lose sight of the fact that people also have different jobs within that system. Like, there might be somebody whose job it is just to make the stools. And so yes, you want somebody who's focused on the system, but I feel like sometimes our digital equity work gets so broad, gets to that, like you're talking about, equity is such a huge thing that people lose sight of, like, there's value in just making sure that we have fiber to every house, even though that's not going to solve any of the downstream questions. That's not going to get people adoption. It's not going to answer all these other things. But if everyone's focused on the big picture and people aren't doing some of the little pieces that fall into that, then you lose traction there too. So I don't know. I think it's a really interesting kind of framework.
Great. Just to wrap up this conversation real quick, gosh, there were so many questions I wanted to get to, but I think we covered all of the main themes here. So with that, I just want maybe less than a minute, just one piece of advice you'd like to share for folks that are sort of exploring, trying to bring more access to broadband in their communities, or they want to take a more equity focus, have that equity lens on these kinds of projects, make that more of a priority. So share sort of one piece of advice that you found helpful in your own efforts that you'd like to pass along. I don't know who to start with, maybe Skip.
All right, I would say, just building off of what Erin just mentioned, it's really important, I think, to just start somewhere. And oftentimes it's about doing something that is actionable, deliverable in a short period of time, and then you build momentum from there. And it could be, essentially, Portland's always criticized as the city that plans, but it could be as simple as like articulating, here's where we're going. Here's where we want to go as a community. And here are some things that we're going to do in the short term, and eventually we want to get to all this other stuff as well. And I think in that way, you're setting expectations, you're communicating effectively with the broader community, and in that way, you avoid the issue of trying to be all things to everyone right out of the gate. And that is the big issue in a lot of this work with nonprofits, with government, is you're supposed to be broadly inclusive and representative of all, but at some point you can't do anything if you're trying to do it all. And I think that's important in saying, okay, here's where we're prioritizing and why. And people can disagree, but it's important to also start doing some of this work.
That's great. Maybe Erin?
To build on that, find the people that are doing the work and engage them. I think a lot of times people start and look for, well, who should I get at the city, or who should I get at the state government, and that's great, look there, but but somebody's probably doing the work. And if you can't find them, then it's probably you. And so go do it. Like, you don't need, some convener organization to convene people if they're not doing the work and it's your passion, your interest. You can go call, anyone can call a meeting. A lot of times it just takes sort of having the confidence to do it.
Great. All right, Sean, you're up next.
I think that the keyword I would agree with Aaron is engagement, and for me, engagement, the trajectory of what I've learned as a leader in this field for a while is it's not about the technology. It's not about the buzzwords. It's really engaging with the leaders in your community, the community itself, the people who set the priorities for the community, the budgets, the initiatives. I spend the vast majority of my time just communicating with, educating, collaborating with my communities and leaders so that it becomes a priority and people understand it's not a technology project. It's really a connectivity. We don't even call it Wi-Fi. We call it our digital connectivity initiative. It's just connecting the community. We always talk about how we want to connect the community better. So we engage to connect. The technologies we use and the vendors we use are kind of immaterial to all that. So to me, that's what I learned, and what I would recommend to other people to think about is just engage and educate and be flexible.
Great. And Mimi, go ahead and finish this out.
Right. This is actually perfect because I think in many ways, my organization, Connected DMV, we are the babies of this group. I mean, we just incorporated this year. So we know enough to know that we are not the smartest people in the room. We might have an idea and we might have a passion for what we're doing, but there are so many other people, not just within our region, but everybody on this panel. I've learned a lot just from joining this 1 hour conversation. And I, imagine there's so much more that I could learn from each one of you and from you, Macy. So, my biggest advice, I guess, and guidance would be to learn from others. There's probably somebody who's already done a lot of the research, a lot of the starting points, a lot of the initial information, and you can try to reinvent the wheel, but it's going to take you a long time. And I definitely agree with Skip's point of try to get some of those quick early wins out, because some of the concepts that we're talking about of infrastructure and resilience and regionalism and collaboration, these are great concepts. These are not necessarily the things that are going to make front page news, and they're not necessarily the things that our communities that we're doing all of this for would find particularly engaging or, could really relate to it, but they could relate to, something else that is more tangible and more action oriented. So yeah, it's going to take a bunch of those to really enact the broader level change, but just moving the needle slightly is well worth it.
Great. And sorry, everyone, we cut into your Q&A. So really, we only have time for maybe one question or two, but just know that all these folks are here. They are your tribe. So I know John and Skip have been posting a lot of links in the chat to familiarize yourself with. I mean, they're all here to connect with you. So feel free to reach out after the session ends. This is only the beginning of the conversation, and these discussions are not just beginning, but they're not going away. And I feel like this time is really putting a microscope on it. So let's see. So just to the first person that answers this, what extent does a lack of broadband infrastructure hamper your efforts? If you've had to overcome some of these, what have your sources of finance been for building out, such as banks? And what role did they take?
I can answer that just quickly. I think what the question's asking is, to what extent do partnerships with other institutions help further creating connectivity? Because government sometimes falls into the trap of thinking, like Mimi said, we have to reinvent the wheel, right? So I think if you're really going to be successful, or at least the way we were successful with doing this, is we started with the assumption that this wasn't a county problem to solve. So we have 16 cities, we have a library system, every city has its own facilities, the schools have facilities. And so one of the first things we did was map out a heat map of all the areas of need and overlay all of the combined facilities that we all share as a partnership, as institutions, and really just made the assumption that they were all available as sort of the backbone to solve this problem. And we sort of ignored the traditional, well, that's not my facility, I can't use it, so that's somebody else's problem to solve. I have to go build my own thing now. And I think that's one of the reasons we've been so successful, is just the fact that we went into this with a partnership sharing mindset on facilities and infrastructure, and we weren't all trying to create our own and duplicate that and have our own brand and take credit for it. You know, we don't really care about those things. You know, our goal is to connect the community, and we don't care whose network it is, whose building it is, what it's called. We just want to get the community connected. So we leverage all those things, and we haven't been as successful as banks. I'll say the private healthcare institutions like Stanford and Kaiser have been amazing. We use a lot of their facilities, and surprisingly, the U.S. Postal Service has stepped up, and we're starting to use their facilities as well.
Great. Gosh, you know what, I'm afraid we're going to go over time, so I'll go ahead and wrap up here. But again, thank you, Skip, Aaron, John, Mimi, you all are amazing. And this was a great conversation. And again, I think we could talk all day, but just for those, you know, that are pursuing this, if there's something that hasn't been going on in your region, go ahead and just get it started. Just start having the conversation, start finding the people to work with. And we know you can do it. And if you bring the equity lens to it, I think that's everything. I think you're starting off with a good foundation and a good foot, and just, you know, keep going, and remember that you have friends that are undergoing this, who have gone through the same challenges as you, but I've also seen the opportunity in those challenges. And like Mimi said, I'm going back to it again, you know, using this as an opportunity, using this crisis, using 2020 as an opportunity to, you know, make something good of it, and to make your communities more resilient, to be able to become better, and serve the next generations that are coming up behind them. So thank you all again. And please stay tuned for the rest of the workshop. Next time, or the next session, will be about the East Coast. So shout out to Connect DMV. But thank you so much. Whoop, whoop. Yeah. And then, so please stay with us for a few minutes. We're gonna get transferred over to the next session. So thank you again.